Got it. Oh my gosh. Who's Annika De Monte? Hello, everybody. Welcome to our 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence webinar. We are all very excited to have you. And yeah, we've been planning this for quite a while, so it's really great that it's finally happening. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Barbara Lusala. I'm a medical student at the University of Pretoria. And today I am joined by Hanan and Kayla, who will introduce themselves in a few minutes. So just to give you all an idea of the flow of the webinar, we're going to start off looking at the kind of backstory and history behind gender inequality and feminism and its place in developing countries. And then we're going to look at the role of healthcare and policy in protecting women's rights and addressing gender-based violence. And finally, we have the Rape Crisis Center and Lawyers Against Abuse, who will be giving us insight on working with victims of gender-based violence and sexual abuse. So we're very excited. We know that it's going to be very informative and hopefully inspiring as well. And you will take something home from it. So I'm now going to hand over to Hanan to continue with the introduction.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. So hi, everyone. My name is Hanan, and I'm a final year BA law student at the University of Pretoria. So just taking it back to the beginning with just what is the 16 Days of Activism. So the 16 Days of Activism is an international campaign that aims to bring awareness to gender-based violences. It started on the 25th of November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And it's going to be running until 10 December, which is International Human Rights Day. And during these 16 days, there is an intensified call for the elimination of gender-based violences by organizations and individuals like ourselves. Every year, the UN Women gives a theme to the campaign. And this year, the theme is Orange the World, End Violence Against Women Now. So the reason that the UN chose to use the color orange is basically that they have taken the color orange to symbolize a bright and optimistic future free from violence against women and girls. And hopefully this will help to unify a large scale and social mobilization. So now my colleague Kayla will be explaining how our theme links to the UN's theme.
Thank you so much, Hanan. I'm Kayla and I'm studying BCom Law at the University of Cape Town. So Hanan, Barbara and I have been working on this webinar for a while, and we thought that it was very important to make it relevant to South Africa's context. So we came up with a slogan on our poster and basically decided or thought that it was very important to include intersectional feminism in developing countries. So gender-based violence has an impact on women in a physical, structural, and psychological sense. So this is why we thought that it was relevant to focus on these points and drawing on its importance in intersectional feminism in developing countries. So this year, the UN suggested that feminism should be used as a tool to end gender-based violence or violence against women. So we thought that it was only right to recognize that barriers to gender equality vary according to other aspects of a woman's identity, such as their race, ethnicity, sexuality, and class. So yeah, Barbara, Hanan, and I are super excited for this webinar, and we're really grateful for all of the amazing speakers that we've managed to get and have been so kind to speak. So yeah, if you have any questions for any of us or the speakers, would you kindly put them in the chat and we will address them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla. So I think that we will now get started with the webinar and just talking to our wonderful speakers. So the first speaker that we have is Professor Christopher Isike. Prof. Isike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
So before we begin, I'd just like to give everybody a brief background on Professor Isike. So he's a professor of African politics and international relations at the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And he's also the current president of the African Association of Political Science. And he consults for organizations like the UNFPA, UNICEF, UN Women, and the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Government on Gender Equality and women empowerment issues in South Africa. So he will definitely have a lot of value and interesting and informative information to share with us. So my first question to you, Prof, looking just at the origins of feminism. Well, from what most of us know and just looking at the history books, we know it to have quite a Eurocentric origin. But over time, we've seen with all the global movements, the definition of feminism has continued to adjust and become more inclusive of the complexities that women face in especially developing countries. But our question for you is that all feminism is? Is it just a Eurocentric framework that everybody else needs to add on to, or is there more to it for women in developing countries?
All right, thank you very much, Barbara, for your question. It's a question I'd like to see as one that is pregnant with many children, but I will try and answer as much as I can. So you permit me to try and be patient, right? So my response would be that the term or concept of feminism may have had its origins from the West, but the practice of feminism is well documented to be common amongst many pre-colonial African societies, for example, which is non-Western. So if we use the basic definition of feminism as a doctrine which advocates the expansion of rights, of the role of women in society, which fights to establish social justice and to get rid of gender inequality. If we take that as a measure, there is a sense in which it has been argued that feminism already existed in many pre-colonial African societies, and therefore these societies could be said to have been inherently feminist in many ways. And if feminism is a person, taking the ordinary dictionary definition of feminism, if feminism is a feminist, is a person who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes, then many women and men in pre-colonial African societies were also feminists, as they took actions that advocated for women's rights in society, in societies where there were abuses of women, in these most pre-colonial African political formations. Now, all of these have been appropriated by African writers, and they are collectively referred to as African feminism. So when we talk about African feminism, we can talk of three generations of African feminist or women's scholarship. I'm talking about the scholarship now, just going from feminism as a phenomenon to ideas of feminism as scholarship. So while the first and second generations were cautious with the term feminism because of its Western baggage, the third generation, to which someone like Chimamanda Adichie, I'm sure all of you know about her, belongs to, conceive feminism differently. For example, they conceive of feminism not in opposition to the West, but in relation to it, and sometimes independently, from it. They understand feminism as a moral issue that transcends cultural differences, racial differences, because it seeks to enhance the dignity of individuals without disrupting, community cohesion. Now, this bit about community cohesion is very important because it helps to distinguish, between Western and African feminism, for example. Now, another distinction in this regard is that in African feminism, a woman's femininity or how one is valued as a woman cannot be separated from culture, ethnicity, and education, all right? So again, genuine African feminism, unlike Western feminism, is a common fight of women alongside men against foreign exploitation. If you look at, the colonial origin of gender inequality in Africa, the acknowledgement of certain inequities in traditional societies, women's financial self-reliance, and the focus on women's issues such as the lack of choice in marriage, the oppression of barren women, female genital mutilations, and the need to look for possible avenues of choice for women. Now, apart from African feminism, we can also talk of other variants of feminism, such as third world feminism or maybe Islamic feminism. Now, Islamic feminism does not merely describe a branch of feminism stemming from countries with Muslim majorities. It is a more revolutionary form of feminism that emerged in the late 20th century as a reaction to the growing influence of political Islam in the Middle East. It challenges the patriarchal readings and interpretations of Islam with regards to the status of women in public and private domains, and asserts gender equality through utilizing feminist tools and methods to reinterpret, note the word reinterpret, the Quran and other Islamic texts from a gender-sensitive feminist lens. Now, it is different from other types of feminism within the Muslim world, and there's research that on the prevalent feminist discourses in the contemporary Muslim world reveals that there's a distinction between three types, if you like, of this would include, secular feminism, Islamist feminism, and Islamic feminism. These are three different things. I'll say them again. It's secular feminism, Islamist feminism, and Islamic feminism, right? So secular feminism, for instance, emerged in the Middle East during the early 20th century and materialized into strong feminist movements demanding the advancement of the status of women in society. Though considerably influenced by the Islamic modernist discourse as one of the identifying features of Muslim societies, secular feminism separates religious and feminist discourses and rather engages with the international instruments of human and women's rights for the achievement of gender equality, okay? On the other hand, if Islamist feminism is the feminism emerging from Islamist movement, which gained a huge influence in the Middle East in the late 70s with the Islamic revolution in Iran. So this is particularly emerging from Iran, right? So you have Islamist feminists such as Zainab al-Ghazali and Safinaz Kazim, who believe that women's quest for equality with men is the main source of their oppression, placing them in unnatural and unfair situations that take away from their integrities and dignities as women. They called women to return to a purer and more authentic domestic life, away from the public life, even though they ultimately had to reverse their rhetoric and call for more women participation to achieve their goal of a new utopia, according to Badran in 2005. Now, departing from the rights-based approach deployed by secular feminists and the more conservative outlook on gender equality and women's status adopted by Islamist feminists, Islamic feminism, on the other hand, bases its quest for gender equality and social justice within the Islamic paradigm. It relies principally, and this is the point of distinction between them, it relies on the interpretation of the same religious texts employed by feminists, Islamist feminists, to call for the advancement of women's status in society and to depart from gender complementarity approach that was adopted by secular feminists with regards to the role of women in the private sphere, and then to demand full and complete gender equality in both the public and private. When I say private here, I mean family domains. In trying to answer how these discussions or this brief overview of feminism that I've given as you know, already existing in non-Western societies. You know, as I mentioned before, the practice of feminism was prevalent in pre-colonial African societies, for example, at least, and I would assume the same for the Asian and Arab worlds, given what I've just said also about Islamist and Islamic and secular feminism. So there's a sense in which we can say that these societies were inherently feminist. As such, they did not and still do not need to be taught feminism by the West. But more importantly, I am careful to say, as an international relations theorist or scholar, I'm careful to say that any ideology or theory is Western, you know, because if you go into the origins of society from which ideology and theory derives, you'll find that there were a mix of Western and non-Western influences in the origins of thought that eventually became, you know, wholly associated with the West. So what we sometimes refer to as Western may actually be global if you go back in time to civilizations that converged at a point in history. Secondly, and this is where I will stop, as I've just said about feminism in the Muslim world, there have been shifts in feminist thoughts over time to suggest that feminism is dynamic and constantly in a state of flux. However, the desire to correct women's second-class status in society remained the common point of equilibrium between Western and non-Western feminisms. Let me stop there and hope that I've answered your question as much as I can.
Thank you, Prof. That, I think we've all just learned so much. I mean, just the whole concept of Islamic feminism, I had never really thought much on, hadn't been exposed on much on. So, and just the idea of enhancing dignity of individuals without disrupting community cohesion. I think that's quite a key point. That is the point of feminism, and something that you inherently see in a lot of countries and developing countries and just across the world. So that leads me to the next question, because we know that especially in developing countries, the circumstances in which we find ourselves is far more complex than those in developed countries. We have things like poverty, different cultural norms, different levels of education, to name a few. And so clearly feminism isn't just about having one policy, a one-size-fits-all policy, because it cannot encompass the challenges of the individuals in a society. And so what would you say are some of the most important things to consider and to kind of make the forefront when expanding the definition of feminism, because it's ever changing, to make it more inclusive? What would you say are kind of the main pillars of, you know, the main factors to consider in that definition?
Well, there are many conceptualizations of feminism, and they are all from, you know, similar and sometimes different standpoints. But I will go with Chimamanda Adichie's definition of feminism as a man or woman. No, she defines a feminist, rather, a feminist as a man or a woman who says, to quote her now, yes, there is a problem with gender as it is today, and we must fix it. We must do better. Now, this is relevant for the times, as it does not restrict feminism only to women's business, okay? It is also a definition that highlights the fact that, contrary to popular misconception, African feminist statements are neither necessarily anti-Western or obsessed with duplicating Western feminism. So according to Kabore, Adichie's feminism is less a response to Western feminism and more a contribution to fight for women's political and economic equality. However, in my view, Adichie's definition also provides spaces for the recognition of other gender identities besides male and female, and by so doing provides an intellectual platform to fight against homophobia, right? So overall, the key things to consider, if I'm to answer your question more directly now, the key things to consider in the ever-changing context of feminism and what it means should include the need to first one, rethink and redefine the states, okay, and governance in the non-Western world. That's one. And second, to prioritize human security. And three, to re-socialize girls and boys, women and men, on how to perceive and treat each other, including other forms of gender and sexualities. Those for me are the three factors that we need to include in a more inclusive definition and practice of feminism today.
Thank you, Prof. That makes a lot of sense. And I think also it's not what I was expecting to hear, but it really does encompass what needs to be addressed, especially thinking about state governance and having more women's voices in the state, re-socializing how we perceive each other. I mean, that kind of just it encapsulates way more than education or, healthcare. So yeah.
Is that what you're expecting to hear? Tell me, I would like to know what you're expecting to hear.
That is what I thought I would hear, but it makes a lot more sense, and it is, yeah, I can definitely see how much more integral that is.
Yes, because the issues you mentioned around, education, around, healthcare, public health, we've just seen that, from the coronavirus, public health is very important. It shows that it's actually the foundation of society. Communists or Marxists will tell you the economy is the foundation of society. But we now realize that public health is actually the foundation of society, because when people are not well, the economy doesn't work. Nobody goes to work and everything crumbles, right? So good public health is the foundation of any society. That's what coronavirus has taught us. But the reason why I went to the broader structural issue of the state is because all of these things are subsumed, under the structure of the state. If you have a state system that is rooted in human security, for example, one that prioritizes people development over, state development or security of state as its focus, what you find is that automatically it will be committed to education, automatically to be committed to public health, automatically to be committed to gender equality. So that for me is a starting point. And most states, or so-called states, I call them contraptions, we have, especially in the third world, in Africa specifically, they are not states, they are contraptions. They are, because they were not designed to be development machines in the same way that the state in Europe and America was designed to be a development machine. So until we can come together and fix that, all these other issues around inequality, whether they be gender or race or ethnicities, they are secondary. The primary issue is to fix the state, and it should be fixed based on the notion of equality of citizens. And automatically, if we're all equal as citizens, the need for discrimination between genders will become non-existent. And this is how society was organized in pre-colonial Africa before the colonialists came and introduced new forms of patriarchies that diseased us.
Thank you, Prof. I think, it's definitely very good to hear. It's a multi-sectoral approach that needs to be focused on.
Absolutely.
And so our final question to you, we know that in South Africa, gender-based violence is our second epidemic, and I'm sure for many countries around the world. But as we said, we're still dealing with so many complexities: racial discrimination, unequal wealth distribution. And this kind of ties in with the question before, but how do you think that gender equality is more important than what we think it is in combating these issues? And do you think that it could ever form a foundation for redress in a more prominent way than what we perhaps think right now?
I would say yes, because like I said before, building a society founded on human security for all is the surest base on which to build a sustainably developed state, right? Within the human security framework that prioritizes people's rights and well-being, that prioritizes a people-oriented approach to politics and development, you will find that we can begin to, get what I call, locate the question, okay, or rather locate the gender question and interrogate which gender group is more vulnerable to human insecurities and why. So in this light, for instance, feminist scholars like Peterson have attempted to factor women into the human security discourse by arguing that the narrow conceptualization of security in traditional terms does more to decrease the security of women than it increases it. Also, it focuses on people and their life circumstances. The human security paradigm opens space for a more inclusive dialogue or opportunity for discourse where not only women can participate directly, but can also demand and give effect to their human rights to life, to their rights to work, good health, involvement in decision-making, and remedy through active political participation. And there are lots of work on this by Andelini, by Fumi Olonishakin in 2015, for example. Now, the implication, therefore, is that human security and human rights are two sides of the development coin. A human security approach to development is rooted in human rights, and the two reinforce one another. So, for instance, for poor women, the recognition that they have certain rights can be empowering. That in itself can be very empowering. And demanding these rights from a people-centered government and getting a policy response represents a move towards development. Now, achieving development, attaining human security and respecting human rights is an ultimate goal for all societies. Okay, so if you ask me whether there are success stories, from an institutional perspective, or if there are success stories in combating gender-based violence and sexism, to solve other problems of the world, my answer would be that the best example of this kind of human security approach, to politics and development are the Scandinavian countries, okay, which have social democracies that are rooted in human security and gender equality. For example, they are having the best records of human development globally, okay, in terms of, the Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Norway, Finland. They have the highest levels of education, okay, all over the world. The literacy levels are higher, the income levels are higher in these countries than anywhere else in the world. So these are eloquent testimony to the success of human security and gender equality approach to politics and development. And another indicator here is the success stories that these states experienced or recorded in managing the COVID-19 pandemic when it first broke out in 2020. What the top 6 states with the best record of state response to the pandemic in the first 6 months had in common was that they all had women as their leaders, from Denmark to Iceland to Finland to Germany to New Zealand to Norway and Taiwan. Okay, all of these states had leaders that were all women, and they had the best records. They had the lowest infection rates, lowest death rates, and because of the way that they responded. So these leaders gifted us. When I say us, I mean all of us interested in feminism and women's rights and the different value that women bring into politics. They gave us an attractive alternative way of understanding and wielding power. Okay, for instance, they showed that transparency, truth, decidedness, empathy, love, and care are attractive alternatives to seeing and using power, as opposed to how men see and use power. This means that women can and do bring a different value to politics, but in my view, only if they are mainstreamed into politics as women and not as she-women or masculinist women. Okay, And one of the challenges of mainstreaming women into politics is that in South Africa, for example, we have 42%, and I think right now it's about 45% of women in parliament, and about the same number in cabinet. But if you compare South Africa to Botswana, that has about only 11% of women in parliament, if you take gender-based violence, for instance, as an indicator, you'll find that South Africa and Botswana are at the same level in terms of policy outcomes. So it raises the question of whether you really need so many women to make a difference. Yes, so many women would make a difference, but again, it depends on what type of women, what kind of women. If these women who are in parliament are coming to power as girlfriends and children of powerful men, then they don't represent women, they represent their benefactors. And that's how you explain, why we have so many women in parliament in South Africa, and South Africa is still the #1 rape capital of the world. Okay, so now all of these give us good and practical theoretical reasons to combat sexism, as they prove that women can be effective, if not better leaders than men, if given a chance to enter into the public and political spaces as women. That's a condition, as women. They can present the world with a leeway out of the many challenges that have been brought on the globe by men's failed leadership, which is the opposite of the human factor that is required to make politics work for all of us. So yeah, I would say yes, there are examples of this in the Scandinavian countries and all these other countries I mentioned, and that it presents an opportunity for us to address some of these global challenges, if only these women will come into politics as women.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think that's just been very insightful, and you've given us a lot to think about, and just like the examples of what a strong and what the right type of leader looks like, especially when we're looking at women. Some of also the shortfalls. It's not just about having a woman in the political space, but having the right woman and the right leader. And I also think that you've laid a very good foundation for the discussions to follow. So thank you very much, Prof, for your time, and look forward to the rest of the discussion as well. So I will now hand over to Hanan. I'll hand over to Kayla, who will be doing our next interview.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So our next speaker is Dr. Mumta Hargovan, and she is a South African medical doctor with a background in community health and a passion for social justice. She is currently studying for a master's in public health with the specialization in health systems and policy. She works as a clinical research manager in the HIV mental health research unit at the University of Cape Town, and her research interests include HIV, gender, and health systems, and policy analysis. So that is super, super impressive, and we're so, so excited to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Hargovan.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, so thank you for inviting me to join in the discussions.
And thank you so much for being here. So our first question to you stems from the fact that we feel that the conversation around GBV in South Africa often centers around the criminal justice system and the needs to improve implementation of legislation and policy making. And we feel like the role of the healthcare system is often neglected in this space. So our question to you is, how can the healthcare system contribute to addressing gender-based violence?
Thanks, Kayla. So when we talk about addressing gender-based violence, it can feel quite overwhelming that there's so many different moving parts. There's a criminal justice system, there's campaigns in the media for 16 Days of Activism, and we've got hospitals, but the hospitals are dealing with COVID, and we're not really sure how to navigate the complexity and how it all fits into the broader national response. So I'd like to start by thinking about the World Health Organization's key objectives in addressing gender-based violence. And these objectives are fluid and overlapping, but it lays down 3 very clear priorities for us to focus attention on and situate the role of the health system in. So the first objective is prevention of violence, and this involves the full range of educational and social behavioral interventions. And importantly, we are seeing more attention being paid to engaging men and boys in this process. This also involves interventions aimed at improving the socioeconomic context for women in this country. The second key objective is strengthening legal and policy frameworks, and this is the topic that tends to grab our attention, and rightly so. We have excellent policies, the Domestic Violence Act, Sexual Offences Act. However, there's challenges to implementation, and as civil society, we do need to keep pushing for improved conviction and prosecution rates for crimes against women. The third objective is what I would like to focus on in relation to the health system. And this objective is mitigating adverse effects and reducing the risk of reoccurrence. So this refers to once violence has already happened, how do we go about limiting the harms that are caused and intervening so that further violence is prevented? And this is where it gets complex again, because we have so many different types of organizations working towards this objective. But I would argue that the most important of all of these is the health system. As our colleague has mentioned, health is the foundation of our society. And the reason why I say that the health system is the most important, arguably, in the response to gender-based violence, is that all women are likely to come into contact with health services at some point in their lives. Many women who are experiencing violence will not ever access legal services or seek out the assistance of an NGO program, but almost every woman will go to the clinic or hospital at some point, even if they're not specifically going there to disclose the violence. In fact, women who experience violence tend to use the health system even more than others, bearing in mind that that violence is not always physical and not always visible. Women are often first seen in primary healthcare facilities for symptoms and conditions that are linked to the violence, but not necessarily directly related. For example, antenatal care, sexually transmitted infections, or mental health services. These all represent possible moments where a healthcare worker may suspect violence and be able to intervene. And they also represent moments of women building trust and familiarity with the health system. So when women eventually do seek professional help for violence, healthcare providers are often the first, the most trusted, and the most accessible point of professional contact. Considering the individual and family effects of violence, the effects on health, and the potential for cycles of violence to recur in the next generations, the first visit to a healthcare service is really a key window of opportunity to make a massive difference, not just in addressing the health concerns of a woman, but also in linking them to other needed services.
Thank you so much for that answer. I actually learned so much, and I hadn't even thought of half of what you said, especially when you said that all women would have accessed a healthcare service in their life and not many reach out to legal services. And I specifically liked the point that you made about building trust and familiarity with the healthcare system. And I think that could really be a step forward in preventing further violence, or just educating women where there's like a gap in their knowledge because of our education system. So thank you so much for that. As you mentioned, there is a need, women have a need beyond the healthcare system. Women subjected to violence have needs beyond healthcare. They need, among other things, safety, social security, economic security, housing, and legal protection. So do you think that more can be done by the healthcare system to support comprehensive service provision at a community level? Or?
Definitely, I would agree that more can be done. The contributions of the health system, though, in the GBV response is severely limited by resource limitations and the context of competing priorities. We have a quadruple burden of disease in this country. That means that at community level, gender-based violence is not always the highest thing on the agenda in terms of resource allocation. So while we do need to advocate for more funding and resources to improve GBV services at community health facilities, we also need to think a bit more about how we can use the resources we already have in communities in a more integrated and efficient way. So to do this, we use a health systems approach. And this means that we need to stop seeing the health system as a standalone entity, but rather see it as an interlinked component of the multi-sectoral response. Barbara, could you please show the image? Thanks. So this picture demonstrates the different role players involved in gender-based violence services. And it's quite an overwhelming picture. This is the maze of services that a woman who has just experienced violence has to navigate. These organizations often operate in a very disjointed manner with no established referral pathways from one organization to the next. It includes state and non-state services. And in low and middle income countries like South Africa, the non-profit sector actually delivers the majority of services for victims of gender-based violence. So there is a very simple, low-cost solution in all of this that can be undertaken at community level. Firstly, we need a map, and secondly, we need to start talking to each other. This means identifying all possible services in a particular community or district and finding out exactly what they offer and who is eligible, and then creating a service directory that can be placed at all facilities. It also means developing partnerships and agreements between services to establish how these referral pathways will work. The idea is that a woman presenting to any one of these facilities can be linked immediately to all the other available resources within the community. And this type of collaboration is a way of optimizing the available resources across the state sector and the nonprofit sector. And this gives us the best chance of meaningfully reducing adverse effects and preventing further harm. The need to strengthen the engagement between the health sector and the nonprofit sector has been recognized as a problem globally. It's a key strategic priority in the World Health Organization's Global Plan of Action for Health Systems to Address Violence Against Women. And it's also been recognized in South Africa. South Africa's policy framework, which is the National Strategic Plan on GBV and Femicide from 2020, this actually acknowledges the massive contributions of the nonprofit sector and calls for better coordination and collaboration across programs and services. So the policy is already there, but implementation does not necessarily need to happen with a top-down approach. This is something that can be undertaken at community level and at low cost, but with very significant potential benefit.
Thank you so much for your insights. I hadn't really thought about the collaboration of all the different sectors and how important the health sector actually is in dealing with healthcare for women that have experienced violence beyond what you would think the healthcare services could provide you with. So thank you so much for that. My next question to you is a more personal one as a health professional. It is, how do you deal with victims of gender-based violence, and what is it like building rapport with patients so that they confide in you? And then further, what can we do who are not in the healthcare sector to replicate or create a safe space for others to confide in us and create a more supportive environment for victims of gender-based violence?
As we've heard, gender-based violence is very prevalent in South Africa, so this is a very relevant question for both within and outside of the healthcare system. I'd like to share some general principles for creating a supportive environment in either context. So firstly, women need privacy and confidentiality to be able to disclose their experiences. Infrastructure and patient flows aren't always conducive to this, but all possible efforts should be taken, bearing in mind that a breach in confidentiality can put women at risk of additional violence. A second key principle is to respect women's choices and autonomy in making decisions related to their care. We can provide information and offer them the range of services, but women should be a part of that process. They should actively participate in their care and feel empowered to make informed decisions. Tying in with the theme of intersectional feminism, to create a supportive environment, we also must recognize that women face multiple forms of discrimination, not only based on gender, but because of race, nationality, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, or other characteristics. So it's important to understand how these unequal power dynamics and social norms perpetuate violence against marginalized groups. In broader terms of creating a supportive environment for victims, we also need to talk about the workplace. Workplace policies within healthcare facilities and across all sectors involved in GBV responses and outside of that need to model and promote gender equality. There needs to be clear policies forbidding violence of any kind in the workplace, including sexual violence and sexual harassment. And this policy should include mechanisms for redress for those subjected to violence and clear disciplinary procedures for those found to be perpetrating it. For my final point, and unfortunately, I think this is something a lot of people learn the hard way, is for anyone involved in supporting victims of gender-based violence, whether it's as a concerned friend or colleague or across the multi-sectoral response, in the health system, social, legal services, the NGO sector, the research sector, something important to remember is our own mental health. Those involved in the area of sexual and intimate partner violence are exposed to deeply personal accounts of women's experiences, and bearing witness to these stories can carry significant emotional cost. Vicarious trauma refers to a transformation or a change in a person's inner experience, resulting from empathetic engagement with another person's stories of trauma. And these stories are usually of suffering inflicted by one human upon another. This concept of the emotional impact of vicarious trauma has some overlap with other conditions, such as secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, and burnout. If you believe a friend or coworker might be experiencing negative reactions to vicarious trauma, consider reaching out and talking to them individually about the impact of the work and encourage them to access mental health services if needed. Institutions doing this type of work should have mechanisms in place to support their staff and prevent vicarious trauma.
Thank you so much for that. I think we can definitely all take something home from your discussion. And I particularly liked your emphasis on respecting, as a healthcare professional, for respecting women's choices and autonomy. And I really liked your mention of intersectional feminism and its importance. And also your emphasis on mental health and advising people in our lives to seek like mental health professionals, because I think it's a lot to take. And because I'm sure based on the statistics, all of us know someone who has been affected by gender-based violence. I think it's really important to encourage people to seek mental health professionals. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you for everything. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone else can agree. Now on to Hanan.
Yes, thank you, Kayla. So next we have Ms. Refilwe Ledwaba from the nonprofit organization Lawyers Against Abuse. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ms. Ledwaba.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So Ms. Ledwaba, prior to joining Lawyers Against Abuse, she worked with Lawyers for Human Rights and interned for the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development in the legal subdivision, monitoring the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act and Protection from Harassment Act. So I think we will benefit a lot from her insight. So actually, one thing that Dr. Hargovan mentioned that struck me quite a lot was the fact that nonprofit organizations give the most aid to gender-based violence, and also just the fact that there's a need for better implementation of the policies and the laws that already exist in relation to GBV. So I think that it's obviously very well, the role that the law plays is very important in our fight against gender-based violence. But the Constitution and our legislation, it seems to promote a more formal and symbolic type of equality that doesn't necessarily transpire in reality. And the issue of GBV is so ingrained into our society. So in your opinion, as a legal professional, do you think that legislation and the threat of criminal action or legal action is enough to combat the issue of gender-based violence?
Thank you so much, Hanan. I believe that it is going to take more than just the law to eradicate gender-based violence. As you have just stated, the pandemic is heavily ingrained into our society, and this is through various sources such as culture, religion, norms, and other social ills. However, that does not mean that the law cannot be used to combat GBV, but it cannot be used as the only form of eliminating it. Personal views and ideologies need to change to allow for the proper implementation of the law. Because if individuals and communities continue to hold toxic patriarchal views which justify unequal treatment of genders, then GBV will continue to be rampant even if legislators develop the law as many times as they can. For example, a perpetrator will not change their ways if they believe that their culture or their religion or personal views justify their patriarchal behavior. Even from their own lived experiences at home and in their communities, and the education that they have been taught in how vulnerable groups are treated. Another example that I can give is with service providers in the form of police officers, the court officials who do not properly carry out the law because of their own personal beliefs and values. If a service provider believes that a person who dresses in a certain way deserves to be raped, a person who walks at night deserves to be raped, a person who accepts gifts from another person of a different gender deserves to be treated in a demeaning manner, then their level of commitment in ensuring that the victim receives a proper service is already compromised. So I believe that until we change the social stance on gender-based treatment, the law and even the threat of imprisonment will only be able to protect the victims of gender-based violence to an extent.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I think it links to what Dr. Isike was saying. I mean, Professor Isike was saying about the perception of women in society and how it doesn't even necessarily need to be a top-down approach. It starts with our community and the individuals of our society. Okay, so my second question relates a bit more closely to our theme, and that's how can the law be used as a tool to promote feminism in developing countries and South Africa specifically for African women, and thus mitigate the occurrence of gender-based violence?
I mean, in South Africa, the country is already ahead in using the law to promoting equality, with our constitution being one of the most progressive in the world. The equality section has been incorporated to ensure equality amongst everyone within the borders of the Republic, notwithstanding gender, sexuality, class, and creed. However, as I've already mentioned earlier, the development of law alone is not enough to combat gender-based violence. Many more approaches are also being used to confront the pandemic, such as the human rights advocacy groups, which have been formed and which continue to use platforms available to advocate for equality. Strategies such as research, campaigns, trainings, media are also being used to raise awareness about the rights of the vulnerable groups women are included. Strategies such as legal literacy that explains what feminism seeks to achieve being prioritized, and communities being enlightened to understand what feminism stands for. Understanding that it does not seek to belittle one gender at the expense of another, or to call for sexism against another gender, but a tool that is being used to promote equality. So I believe that even with the law, we still need to have legal education where people are more informed and educated about what feminism is, what gender-based violence is, so that they are better equipped to act when they are faced with such violence. Another strategy that can be used, that has been used by mostly civil society when they use the courts to establish legal precedent, which seeks to promote and protect the rights of vulnerable groups. We have seen many groups approaching the Constitutional Court where most customary rights that seem to protect the rights of one gender at the expense of another have been confronted. Issues such as inheritance, we've seen with issues such as the ownership of land, and most especially those relating to the decision on the sexual and reproductive matters being confronted. I believe that in South Africa we have such cases before the Constitutional Court, which confronts inequality that stems from century-old beliefs, which have resulted in the legal reform. I also believe that the creation and the development of legislation that seeks to confront laws and behaviors that enhance position of gender inequality, and also changing the legal standing of women. I mean, legislation is another tool that has been used for years to confront oppressive laws and to adapt to changing conditions. We have laws such as the Sexual Offences Act, as the doctor has already mentioned. We have laws such as Domestic Violence Act. We have laws such as Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act. These laws are the examples that have been created and that have been developed through the years, which although I feel are moving at a slow rate, but they're still moving in the right direction. We are still seeing change.
Yes, I think it is quite sad that the implementation of these laws is not happening as in the way that we want it to, and it seems as if there is still a lot to be done in terms of things like customary law, but hopefully we are moving in the right direction, and hopefully we can get there someday with better implementation of the legal officers, police officers, etc. But thank you. So moving on to a more victim-centered approach now, why do you think it is important for victims of gender-based violence to get legal assistance?
I believe it's crucial for victims of gender-based violence to receive legal assistance from organizations such as LVA. I'm being biased, but yeah, because these organizations do not only understand how the criminal justice system works, but are also aware of the gaps that are present in the system. So It makes it easier for them, for the victims, to navigate the system with a better understanding of what it entails. For instance, explaining how the justice system works in the initial stages of the case prepares the victim for what to expect and also better manages their expectations. Keeping them updated on the progress of the case also provides the assurance that the case is ongoing, and in turn, they do not lose faith in the system. Also describing the role players, because in the criminal justice system, there are so many role players before a case can go to trial. Even during the trial stages, there are so many role players that are involved. So if the client is explained the roles of everyone who's involved in their case, then they are always aware of who they are dealing with and for what purpose. The knowledge that for them, the knowledge that there is somewhere to go, the knowledge that there is someone who is always willing to explain and clarify any terms and procedures which they may not understand is critical. And as such, it encourages the victims of gender-based violence to see the legal remedies which are available to them through.
Yes, definitely. I think it must be so daunting for victims to, just speak out firstly and then also seek recourse. So it's amazing that there are organizations like Lawyers Against Abuse that help them in this regard. And then just as a final question to you, can you please explain for everyone here what work does Lawyers Against Abuse do specifically?
So Lawyers Against Abuse is an organization that uses an integrated approach where we provide legal and therapeutic support to the victims of gender-based violence, and we are based in Diepsloot and Orange Farm. So the mission of the organization is to strengthen the justice system's response to gender-based violence. We have different units. We have the legal unit, we have the psychosocial unit, we have the community engagement unit. So with the legal unit, we provide assistance and support throughout the entire legal process, whether in securing a protection order or in pursuing a criminal case. We do this by ensuring that the clients are aware of their legal rights, they are aware of available legal remedies, while also pushing the legal systems to work the way that it should. With regards to protection orders, we assist clients in applying for protection orders. We explain the submission process. We prepare clients for final hearing. And we also ensure that when protection orders are granted, they are enforced. And then with regards to the criminal cases, we provide a comprehensive support from the initial police report. We liaise with investigating officers, with the prosecutors which assigned the cases. We support the victims throughout the trial, wherein the client is always accompanied to court when they are required. We have a technical support and legal advice program, which is available to the individuals and organizations which are outside Diepsloot and Orange Farm, who seek legal advice on both protection orders and criminal cases which are related to gender-based violence. And then with our psychosocial team, they provide therapy and counseling, wherein the drama therapist uses different forms of therapy to support clients' emotional and mental healing journeys. The drama therapist uses the therapeutic techniques to cater for unique needs of the individuals who come, where therapy can be conducted on an individual basis or in a group setting. We also have a program for the court preparation and court debriefing, where before each court hearing, the drama therapist explores the fears and the anxieties of the client and provide practical information about how to cope with going to court. We have caregiver workshops where we provide education to the parents and the guardians of the minor victims of gender-based violence with an object to equip them with practical skills to support their children. And then with our community engagement, the unit uses their expertise in empowering social change, where we empower young women and young girls to confront GBV in their communities through workshops where participants develop a deeper understanding of gender-based violence from an intersectional feminist framework. And then those participants, when they leave the workshop, they will then form community action groups, which then serves to disseminate knowledge which they gained through the workshop. They would then now share that information in their communities to ensure that the broader society is reached. We have outreach and awareness raising campaigns where we conduct targeted outreach campaigns throughout Diepsloot and Orange Farm to raise awareness of gender-based violence, to educate people about their legal rights and about their available legal remedies. We do this by having weekly talks at the clinics. We have a monthly segment at the community radio station, and we have community workshops with other service providers in the communities. So that's the work that Lawyers Against Abuse do in the communities of Diepsloot and Orange Farm.
Wow, that's amazing. I think like just addressing the legal as well as the psychological needs of a victim is so necessary. And it's so necessary in general just to have organizations like these, especially in a country that's so plagued with violence against women. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us and for giving us such insightful information on the law and its relation to gender-based violence.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think next is Barbara, and she will be in conversation with the representative from the Rape Crisis Center.
Thanks so much, Hanan. So a couple of people have just joined us a little bit later, so welcome if you've just come in. And just to kind of give you an overview of what we've discussed, we've had a wonderful conversation with Professor Christopher Isike, who kind of laid down the background of feminism and also just given us insight on African feminism and what that means and how it doesn't necessarily have a name like we know more Western feminism does, because it is kind of ingrained in kind of especially pre-colonial, during the pre-colonial era, it was already ingrained within culture, and its foundation was enhancing the dignity of individuals without disrupting community cohesion, and it's everybody's job. And also just the importance of incorporating the women as they are as women to bring their own valuable characteristics and insight into policy, the political space, and just seeing how impactful, giving us very practical examples of how countries with female leaders have managed to combat COVID very efficiently and kind of set an example for the rest of the world. And then we had a really great conversation with Dr. Mumta Hargovan on the healthcare system, and just learning about how it's almost directly related to the essential services that gender-based violence patients need, and healthcare policy as well. Things like social services, justice, child protection are all related to healthcare and healthcare policy as well. And healthcare services are often the first point of disclosure for gender-based violence victims. And so it's really important to have a safe space and to be non-judgmental and understanding when dealing with, when interacting with these victims, because it affects their health-seeking behavior in the future as well. So yeah, and just the importance of coordination and collaboration between NGOs and the state, because the whole point is to provide a very comprehensive care for the gender-based violence victims, which is something that NGOs already address. And so that collaboration between state and NGOs just closes the gap, and it helps to address the issues that we have, especially in this country, a lot more efficiently, which is very much needed. And then Hanan just spoke to Ms. Refilwe Ledwaba from the Lawyers Against Abuse, and we just kind of learned about the role, the process that Lawyers Against Abuse, the services that they provide for gender-based violence victims, and the importance of equipping the victims with education and how to deal with the system, because that also empowers them and gives them reassurance of the progress with regards to their cases, and also understanding that they are in a position of vulnerability and they are affected by the societal stance. Like people, even in positions of authority and judicial systems, can have their own personal biases and understandings of having like a societal stance and cultural understanding of the role of kind of what victims have experienced, and that bias can come in and it gets in the way of victims actually receiving the justice that they deserve, and that kind of makes people lose faith in the justice system. So the work that Lawyers Against Abuse is doing is very important, and I thought the very useful thing that Lawyers Against Abuse do is the community action groups that form through this organization that go back into their spaces. People go back into their spaces and debunk the myths and misconceptions that people have when it comes to coming forth and, you know, coming forth and addressing and combating gender-based violence. So thank you to all the speakers so far. And now we are going to be in conversation with Ronel Koekemoer from the Rape Crisis Center. Hi, Ronel, good evening.
Hello, future doctor.
Thank you so much for joining us. The Rape Crisis Center does amazing work, and just to give everybody a background, Ronel is a counseling coordinator at the Rape Crisis Center in Cape Town, and she's been counseling survivors of sexual violence for over 5 years, and she has a master's degree from UCT, which focuses on abortion law in South Africa. So just her experience with victims and also just working with the Rape Crisis Center, I think it's going to be a very insightful conversation. So thank you so much for joining us. So the first question that we have is if you could just take us through the process of working with victims of rape, and from the time they walk through the door all the way out, and some of the challenges that you face in this environment.
All right, so thank you for having me. It was very well summarized as well, and your recap, that was very impressive. So the way we sort of work is Rape Crisis focuses on a variety of what we call post-rape care and justice services. And most survivors come to us through the counseling department, and then we're able to put them in touch with sort of other role stakeholders in the arena. But basically what happens is a survivor will contact the center by phone, as a walk-in over the WhatsApp line, and they will be contracted with a counselor, which is a community member counselor who's been trained in specifically in rape counseling and sexual violence. And we contract people for plus minus 12 sessions, but if people need more, then we do more. If they need less, we do less. We're very survivor focused, so we try to make it, as much as their pace and what their needs are to meet that there. And we usually see the survivor maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks. Often we find that survivors who've been raped recently, so if it happened over the weekend, for example, they might come for 1 or 2 sessions and then never come back or, disappear. And then maybe a few months later or a year later, they come back. So, the way people process rape trauma is very different. So we're quite cognizant of that process as well. But then we also have things like similar to the Lawyers Against Abuse, where we have court supporters who walk through that rape trial process, because rape trials can take years. I think people think it's a law and order special victims unit type situation, but it's very costly. It's very long-winded, and as I think all the speakers said, there's a real dearth of implementation that's happening. So a lot of cases slip through the cracks at various points and with various role players. And then we also have a Making Change project, which goes into communities and does workshops around rape myths and sexual violence and what to do immediately afterwards if you need help, and in schools and things like that. So it's like a whole bunch of services mainly concentrated on sexual violence. I think in terms of challenges, the biggest, for me personally, the biggest challenge with dealing with survivors is the secondary victimization that a lot of them have to deal with because of the way our society is still extremely conservative, extremely patriarchal. So there's a lot of backlash from society when survivors come forward, especially when the perpetrator is somebody they know. And what we know is that in majority of cases, the perpetrator is known to the survivor. So often the perpetrators also are people with certain kinds of authority or power. So they're religious leaders, or they're teachers, or they are lecturers. So there's also sort of backlash there. And to get the survivor in the room, in a counseling room, it's not so much about always the actual rape itself and the moments of that, which might have, not lasted for a very long time. It's about that experience and also how those around you react to that experience. And I think that that's a big challenge because you can't, we can't control that. We can't put society on trial if they are nasty to a survivor. We can't put the police on trial if they turn a survivor away. And definitely something I've noticed, and I don't have an explanation for it, but is there's a lot of internalized blame survivors carry, and you can be the most feminist out there and know the rhetoric of it's not your fault, but I think our society reinforces that so much that a lot of survivors take that guilt on, and they think that they did something, and it's a hard thing to shift because it is so socialized into us. So I would say that's the two biggest challenges, I think. And obviously working with a person who's traumatized comes with all sorts of sort of emotional, behavioral, physical manifestations. So, we've had everything from panic attacks to suicide attempts to, people not being able to stop crying or things like that. So it's really something that you have to problem solve in the moment because, each survivor responds differently. So I think those are the big challenges. And also, we can't promise survivors that they will get a guilty conviction in their case. And it's, we wish that that's like something we could do. But, there was a study in 2017 about rape trials in South Africa. And they found that of the trials that went all the way through, only 8.6% of those trials resulted in a guilty verdict of rape. So what often happens is the magistrates will find perpetrators guilty of lesser offenses like GBV or assault or things like that, and then it carries lighter sentences. But to get a conviction for rape, which carries quite a heavy sentence, is incredibly rare. So our job as counselors is then to help the survivor walk that path, but make sure that their recovery is independent of the outcome of that. So whether or not it's a guilty verdict, they still need to recover and heal. And that can be quite challenging.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that just looking at, especially how you mentioned, no matter how feminist you are, how much information you have, if that situation, someone finds themselves in that situation, especially as women, because of the society that we live in, we still condemn ourselves, and just that emphasizes how much of a vulnerable and emotional experience. And that's why I think so difficult for people also to almost like empathize, I think, to put it very lightly, empathize with the survivors, because it is something that it's not just about the moment, it's about someone else exerting their authority, their dominance, their command, you know, a violation of human rights, really, essentially, that's what it is. So it's a lot more complex than I think what people understand it to be. And so that individualized attention and 12 sessions, you know, it's so important. It sounds like a lot. I mean, I wouldn't think that it would be 12 sessions, but I mean, I think it's so important and necessary. So moving on to the next question, just in your experience, what are the psychological implications and kind of long-term effects of sexual abuse and harassment and rape?
Well, I think what you hit the nail on the head there, in that it is it's a complicated thing, and it is such a violation of human rights. And it's especially because I think it sounds funny, but we often underestimate the impact of a violation of bodily autonomy that comes with rape, and the violation of the body and genitals and, you know, sex organs and things like that. And as a particularly conservative society, we are taught that, you know, sex is bad, you don't talk to your children about sex, sex is shameful, all those things. So, you know, rape not only is a physical violence, but it hits people where it would hurt the most, because there is so much shame and social meaning attached to sex and sexuality as well. So dealing with that is its own sort of monster as well. And the way that we conceptualize it at Rape Crisis is through a model called post-rape trauma syndrome, which is basically a form of a post-traumatic stress disorder response, but specialized to sexual violence. So in doing that, you recognize that it's a trauma response. So even though the rape might have happened 20 years ago, the body is still stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And the brain is still considering things as being dangerous or threatening, which is there's a lot of talk these days about triggers. And triggers are actually a trauma response, because a trigger tells the brain, we're in danger, you need to do something. Because it's not clicking that, you know, you're safe here, it's just reminding you that, you know, it's just reminding you of something. So it is a trauma response. So you'll see things like hypervigilance, heightened anxiety, depressive episodes, a lot of crying, or no emotional affect at all, loss of motivation to do things. And also things like, you know, survivors will experience memory loss or lack of concentration, or struggling to focus, loss of hope in the future, things that are very sort of depressive, anxious symptomology there. But then you'll also see behavioral changes. So things like we often see survivors have a very decreased interest in sex, or an increased interest in sex that's much more than it used to be. Or you'll see behaviors like isolation. So they will isolate themselves from their communities or their families. They will, you know, start engaging in sometimes called obsessive behaviors. So, you know, checking their locks, or making sure that, you know, they've got 5 people on their phone they can call. And then obviously things like substance abuse and drugs, alcohol, things like that, but also around suicide and suicidal ideation. So those are like your broad symptomology. And obviously some survivors will show more of that, and some survivors will show very little of that. But what's important about having a symptomology is so that survivors know it's okay to feel upset about what happened to you. It's okay to struggle to sleep or have nightmares. It's you know, you're not being dramatic, you're not overreacting. It's an incredibly traumatic experience, and you know, these feelings and these emotions are valid. So that's why we start from a position of like a PTSD, even though some survivors will not experience that necessarily. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And I think, like you said, just having that etymology is so important in kind of normalizing the traumatic response of patients, especially in the patriarchal space in which we find ourselves, women are known to be quote unquote emotional, you know, and so it is very easy, I think, for one to be suffering from the traumatic symptoms and everybody just being like, well, you need to get over it.
Get over it. Yeah.
Dramatic, you know, and
Exactly.
so yeah, it's really, really important and helps with, I think, empowerment and also just the process of kind of recovering from the trauma as much as possible to have those things normalized. And so, you know, education. So,
yes. We
so,
love it. We love it.
Exactly. So my final question to you is very similar to Kayla's question to Dr. Hargovan. We know that it takes a very long time for victims to come forward and often don't come forward. When they do, they don't come forward to organizations, go through the legal system. They will talk to a friend or they'll talk to, you know, somebody that they can trust that necessarily isn't involved in those systems. But it is not the most comfortable conversation to have, you know, and a lot of us don't know how to deal with it, and we want to be empathetic and supportive, but we don't know how. What advice would you give to supporters and the people around us? Because it has to be done as much as it is difficult.
Yeah, and as much as it is difficult, what we've seen, and it's supported by research, is the stronger a person's social support network, the better their outcome, their mental health outcome and their trial outcome. It just makes the whole thing easier to deal with, or easier to manage rather. And to supporters, I mean, you know, and I love that you guys are talking to professionals, because I think that we need to get professionals and expertise on board. But there's also, you know, we need communities at the level of your mother or your best friend at school or your favorite teacher to know what to do. So to supporters, I would say, first and foremost, is to be survivor-centered in everything you do. So you might think that you need to call in the army, you need to get the police involved immediately, but if the survivor is not wanting to walk that path, you can't force them to report, and you shouldn't force them to report. So just to listen to them as much as they need you to listen to them. And a lot of survivors don't want to talk about it, and that's okay. They don't have to talk about what happened in detail for it to be a valid experience. But then it's important to focus on the symptomology. So how can you help them with, you know, their changes in their appetite, or the fact that they're not sleeping? So you sort of go back to basic survival things: eating, exercise, sleeping properly, nourishment, things like that, connection. And to just be empathetic, you know, like I was saying earlier about the secondary victimization, I mean, it takes nothing from us as friends of rape survivors to believe them at their word and give them the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I think a lot of, you know, there's still this idea that some women are lying, you know, and or that doesn't sound plausible, or she started having sex but then changed her mind. And, you know, it's just, you don't, you know, she's going to be judged, or they're going to be judged by all sorts of sectors of society. You don't have to be one of those people, you know, like, you can be the person in a survivor's life who's just like, you know, I believe you. How can I help you? What do you need from me? And then in things like, if they are engaging with the healthcare system or the criminal justice system, it's an exhausting process. I mean, to get DNA, the forensic evidence through the lab is like its own battle. And to get the prosecutor, and remember, you know, these prosecutors and the investigating officers, you get some real champions in the sector, you really do. But so many of them are, you know, this is their whole day is consumed by cases like this, and they are busy. So they forget to update survivors, or they don't give them a call to say he's out on bail or whatever the case is. So you as your supporter, your role can be, you can be like, I like to say, the Karen or the Karen in a rape survivor's life. Follow up, call the manager, be like, listen, what's happening? Why is he on bail? We saw him there. You know, call the prosecutor, be like, when's the consultation? When are we in court again? So that the survivor can just show up when they need to, and you can be that person who's keeping their hands on on the activities and what's going on. To be able to advocate on behalf of a survivor is an incredibly empowering thing, because it lets them get on with their healing without having to deal with all these layers of, just bureaucratic nonsense sometimes. And then obviously to also just know what to do if someone comes to you. And I think I loved what Dr. Hargovan spoke about, because, we are seeing a strengthening in, we call them like forensic units or Tutuzela care centers, which are basically like one-stop centers for rape survivors. And they're all over the country and they're free of charge. They're not in every hospital, but you go to a Tutuzela care center after being raped, you don't even have to have gone to the police first. When you enter the system at the TTCs, the Tutuzela care centers, which is a healthcare unit, you can get medical attention. So that's things like your morning after pill, your post-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, or any STI antibiotics that you might need. And then you can also have access to the forensic exam, which is sort of what most people know as a rape kit. So taking, DNA evidence of semen or saliva or skin cells or things like that. And then also that's where you can get access to things like counseling, and they can call the police. The FCS is the specialized unit, and they open what's called a J88 form, which is recording the sexual violence incident. And you don't have to report to access that service. But what's helpful is that if you do decide to report in 20 years' time, that process was initiated as well. And it can really help a survivor access services that they wouldn't necessarily be able to otherwise. So I cannot stress that enough about these units. And like the doctor was saying, it's at the healthcare level where people can access things like this. So I think, for supporters to be aware of what's that process. And if the police says to the survivor, no, you're not going to win your case, then the supporter must be like, no, you're not the prosecutor or the judge. You don't get to decide that. We have the right to a female officer to have the statement written in the language we're comfortable in. So to be the sort of irritating person, and yeah, like I said, to just be sort of survivor-centered as well, in everything that you do.
Thank you very much, Ronel. I mean, it's just a flood of information that we, no, it is so important. These are things that I feel should be mandatory information that everybody should know, like the Tutuzela care centers. When you look at, the state initiative in combating gender-based violence, and we know that sexual violence is such a, it's at the very top of the list. We need this information. It's not just about preventing, but also dealing with the aftermaths and the after effects. So, and for supporters, treating the symptoms, and not trying to be, because I think one of the most intimidating things is that you want to say all of the right things to the supporter and fix their problems right now. And, it's not always possible, but something that we can all do is, when they haven't eaten, talk to, when they need space, when they need someone to talk to, be there for them, be the Karen. Finally, a good connotation for Karen. So that is just so important. And it's so off topic, but information about post-exposure prophylaxis and the morning after pill, and equipping women with that information and knowledge, like it's a horrible place experience, but it's not the end of the world. There's so many ways you can protect yourself after the case. And even just the right to a female police officer. I don't think I was very much aware of that. So that is just
in the language of your choice. You have the right to, and that's often they'll be like, no, we don't have a Tswana speaker. You have to say it in English. And that's not true. It makes the police's job harder though, and then they don't want to do it, which is the thing. But I'm sorry to also veer off, but I just wanted to mention on the topic of the post-exposure prophylaxis is that That is why it's so important to get a survivor to a forensic unit or to Dizela care centers, because if you've been raped, there's a 72-hour window that is absolutely crucial. So within 72 hours, you need to access the post-exposure prophylaxis. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And the morning after pill is also, I think it's a 48-hour window. So even if you don't want to report, just to have access to that medication as soon as possible is so important. And there's actually no statute of limitations on rape in South Africa. So you can report a rape 20 years after the fact. You might not get to trial, but you know, you don't have to feel like you have to do it right now. So
yeah, and of course, just the last thing for me, believing the victims, I think, is so important. And also, I feel, I don't know, it becomes very controversial. There's a lot of opportunity for controversy, but if you just look basically at the statistics of false allegations, the ratios are just so small that, especially as a supporter, as a loved one of the survivor, you know, your role, I don't know, I feel like your role becomes very clear once you just look at statistics and look at your relationship, you know, with the victim and the survivor. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very, very insightful. And I'm sure that everybody else also learned a lot. So moving on, I'm now inviting Kayla to interview our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So I'd like to welcome Lushomo Simatele, who is one of the main educators of the activist group Girls Against Oppression. They have over 90,000 followers on Instagram. They really do a lot. They are a community organization that takes an intersectional approach to social justice education. She is also an activist researcher for the registered NPO, South African Women Fight Back, who focus on combating the GBV pandemic in South Africa. She's currently a gender violence and conflicts master's student at the University of Sussex in the Department of International Development, where her focus is decolonializing activist spaces for the sake of grassroots African development. So that is really impressive. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We really appreciate it. Thank you. So my first question for you is, what has your experience been in terms of raising awareness about serious issues like gender-based violence on a social media platform like Instagram?
If I were to sum it into one word, I would use the word chaotic. Social media is a very nuanced space, and obviously I think everyone's aware of like the isms and the dangers of social media. The danger of spreading information and fear-mongering, for example. But however, I think I speak for the entire Girls Against Oppression team when I say we don't find particular use on focusing on the negatives of social media as opposed to learning to navigate it properly, because it doesn't change the fact that that's where the people are. Particularly if you look at like the Zillennial, Gen Z, Millennial generation, that's where they're all present, particularly when it comes to social justice issues and topics on violence. They tend to be, I want to use the word inaccessible, so they can either be far too academic or they happen in spaces which are echo chambers. I can say this is someone who, when I'm in South Africa, obviously I'm overseas to study right now, but I only just got here in South Africa forever. You go to rallies with the same people, the same organizations, speaking to the same people. So it almost becomes a space of reaching to choirs. With social media, what happens is whether people are agreeing with you or not.
Sorry, Lou. Sorry to interrupt you. I think we're just having a little bit of difficulty hearing you. I'm not sure if there's anything you could do about that.
Can you guys hear me better now?
Yes, that is much better. Thank you.
Sorry, I think maybe I was a bit quieter.
No, that's perfect.
But I was basically saying that we don't find use in focusing on the negative side of social media rather than learning. It's better to learn to use it properly, to navigate it properly. The thing with social media is, especially with how rapid things can spread, it forces people to join the conversation, whether they like it or not. I mean, if you look in the context of gender-based violence in South Africa, things like Am I Next, Men Are Trash, those spread like wildfire, and they force people who otherwise wouldn't have had access to the conversation of gender-based violence, or otherwise just really wouldn't have given a damn, to be quite blunt with you, to like actually sit down and talk about it. And I use the word chaotic because it's the one thing to just sort of like create resources, which is what I think people think Girls Against Depression only does, that we just, create these like cute little gradient posts and that sort of thing, but we don't. We raise funds, we network. I'm so happy to see Ronel from Rape Crisis here, because we're absolutely in love with their work and we're constantly like linking people to them and other like centers in South Africa, because it really is the NPOs and the NGOs on the ground that are really doing the work to combat this pandemic. I mean, gender-based violence in South Africa, I think we really think of it as a disease that goes against depression, because it is the way it's so prevalent in our society, the way it actualizes itself. And so I think one of the reasons why we're so focused on using social media as a platform is because there's this idea that gender-based violence stops at a woman being attacked. And that's not the case. Perpetrators don't just wake up and say, hey, I'm going to sexually assault someone. There's factors that lead perpetrators to be in an environment where they feel comfortable enough and empowered enough to do that. And a lot of that needs to start with breaking down cultures, having very difficult conversations. And it is very difficult conversations. And I will say, particularly because we use the platform of social media, we get a lot of male pushback. We get a lot of women who are dealing with internalized misogyny, who mistake that internalized misogyny for African culture, giving a lot of pushback. That's the way things have always been. But the fact of the matter is women are dying, queer folk are dying, children are dying. And it's because of how prevalent rape culture is. So I think we try to make topics around rape culture and discourse around rape culture digestible. And as much as it's like 10 slides, if you do it enough and drum the same thing over and over again, if you put it and it gets enough reach, it really helps. Often we get people coming to the page or commenting onto the page who get really angry with us with what we've said. And then they'll follow the page just to comment hate, which makes no sense to me. But eventually they see enough resources and enough posts and they're like, wait a minute, I have more questions. Oh, I didn't think of it that way. And so whereas I don't think it's my job as a woman, particularly as a Black queer woman, to educate, I've decided to use it Girls Against Depression from my own initiative to educate, as much as it can be tiring, as much as it can be chaotic, as I said, because we need to be able to have these conversations, because it's all these little steps that lead up to what made us the rape capital of the world in the first place that we don't want to talk about. And so I think social media is a really good space to have these conversations where people can be made to feel safe, where people can sort of like step back for a minute. That's the nice thing about social media. It's not necessarily in your face. If someone needs to, they can turn their phone off and distract and walk away. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I did waffle on a bit there.
No, thank you so much. That really did answer my question. And I'm personally a big fan of your page, and I've learned so much through your page.
Thank you so much.
And I think like we can all agree that social media, especially over this past year, has really been a really good platform to educate people who wouldn't have otherwise seen any of those statistics or any of the information that you're posting on the page. So it is a really, really helpful platform. And you spoke a little bit about how some people don't agree necessarily with what you're posting, and yet they follow you, end up hating your comments or sending hate comments, and then actually end up changing their mind. So my question to you is what have you found that has worked and what hasn't worked in educating people about gender-based violence, particularly men or just anyone who, I don't know, who feels attacked by the term almost? Because sometimes I feel like the people who are having conversations are the ones who, they already are quite educated on the topic, and men are not very involved in talking about it, and they need to listen and educate themselves. So my advice, or my question for you is, how can we encourage those type of people to talk about the topic? Or
I think discernment is probably one of the most important things, no matter what space you're in when you're working with GBV. When I first entered activist spaces, I remember that I would sit down with men who would give me pushback. I could sit down for 3 or 4 hours with one man just explaining why it was important for men to join discourse, feminist discourse, gender-based violence discourse, breaking down rape culture, understanding toxic masculinity, and that's not the only type of masculinity. But eventually, it got to a point where I thought about it quite bluntly. We shouldn't have to beg men to want to educate themselves on why it's not okay to rape, to be crude about it. We shouldn't have to. And I think one of the problems with the fight for GBV right now, well, not problems, but obstacles we're facing, is there's such a heavy reliance on women and queer folks to be on the ground and have to navigate spaces of trauma, navigate triggering spaces for them in order to not only ensure their survival, but to ensure the dignity and the survival for other survivors and the fallen angels of gender-based violence. And so I sort of moved from encouraging men, well, not encouraging, maybe that's not the word. I don't have a focus, I would say, on encouraging men so much as I give it to them as it is. Being polite, I learned, navigating these spaces will only get you so far. However, it's important, words hold power. Words hold extreme power. And so when articulating arguments and stuff, I never articulate my arguments as an attack. So if someone takes it as an attack, that happens a lot. I'm sure you can imagine when I'm talking with men. They'll be like, oh, but you're attacking men and you hate men. You're just anti-men. We get it all the time in conflict discussion. And my simple question to that and response to that is where? Where did I say I was anti-men? If you can point it out to me, I'll be happy to sit down and have a conversation with you. But the fact of the matter is, there has to come a point, and I think as an African society, as a society that is supposed to be gender inclusive, but you're finding gender marginalized folks go through such pain systematically, I think we've reached a point where we need to stop begging for men to join the conversation. They should know. So we need to go about our business and go about our educational practice. If they join the conversation, they need to obviously be respectful about it. But I don't feel a need to coax men to join the conversation, because just having to coax men and sort of sugarcoat things or paticate men to join the conversation is already telling to me that they're not there for a transformational reason. Earlier I said that you need to use discernment, and one of the things I found, when I was thinking about how I used to sit with men a lot and try to argue and try to get them and convince them, is that some people who are not joining these discourses or these fights for the sake of actually helping or for the sake of actually learning. It does not matter what you say to them, they won't learn. They only learn from practicality. They only learn from a practical standpoint. So when it comes to getting men to join the discourse on gender-based violence, I honestly think the focus for activists and NPOs and NGOs should be to just channel more energy into their own work. Eventually, men around you will see what is going on, will fall in line, essentially. I hate to use that word, but will fall in line. But from my experience, especially also being an activist researcher with for SA Women Fight Back, is you're channeling energy in the wrong place. Wanting to force men to don't see it as a serious problem and having that be your focus is challenging it into the wrong place. However, I would like to take the opportunity to recommend organizations such as Langa for Men. They're amazing. There's also President at the time who do have a male-focused approach to understanding gender-based violence, but they are men themselves. And the problem is men have this habit of only wanting to listen to other men. It's really important that they have these conversations amongst themselves and don't become reliant on gender marginalized folks to educate men. I'm not quite sure if I answered your question.
No, you answered it perfectly. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your contribution, because I feel like whenever I'm having a conversation about gender-based violence, specifically to men, I just work myself up and it's very counterproductive. I should be putting my energy elsewhere.
Just to jump in there, sorry to interrupt you, but one of the speakers earlier said what was really important about mental health, particularly if you put yourself in a sphere, no matter what like medium you're working in, whether it's in a hospital, whether you're an academic, whether you're an activist, whether you're a grassroots NGO, it's really important to be aware of your mental health. I think particularly if you are on the intersection of the people that you're advocating for, many people in this sort of sector of work are also survivors themselves. And so you can't pour from an empty cup. You literally cannot pour from an empty cup. And that's why discernment, especially the past few months, has become so important to me. Because also when you put yourself in a position of, I work to combat against gender-based violence, you can't exactly pick and choose when you want to educate sometimes. You can't exactly pick and choose when you want to be an activist. You can't pick and choose sometimes when you want to go deal with a court case and that sort of thing, etc. And so you really need to be conscious of your own mental health. Is engaging in this conversation going to help someone? Is it going to bring forth productive knowledge? If not, and I think this is probably like a sacrilegious thing to say being an activist, but I honestly think it's okay sometimes to tap out. I think there's this idea that if you were working in this sector, that you're invincible and that you just have all the mental strength in the world and you can constantly do anything and everything. And you should be okay with putting yourself on the line of triggering topics with people who can literally usurp the energy out of you. But it's okay, tap out. Your mental health is important too.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your contribution. And I really like how you emphasized mental health, because I think like all of us here clearly care about gender-based violence, but I think it is important to put our mental health first. And I think that will be the best way that we can actually educate other people, is if we're in a good space. And yeah, so thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your contribution. And yeah, now on. Thank you.
I'd just like to say that it's very inspiring to see Kayla and Lou in conversation, because they are both influencers. Kayla is also part of a very influential Instagram group that is just doing amazing things, raising awareness about the challenges in South Africa. So they definitely had their wavelengths were definitely aligned when they were exchanging notes, and of course enlightening the rest of us. So moving on, thank you, Lou, again for your contribution. To Hanan, we had hoped to have a Q&A session at the end, but our wonderful speakers have been answering the questions in the chats, and we did decide, since we are university students who are done with exams, we are going to put together a newsletter for this the conversations that we've had today. And so all of the questions and their answers have been answered, and they will be included in the newsletter. And everybody who joined the webinar, we have all of your emails, so we will email them to you and you can share them with people. And Kayla's Instagram is called Controversial Convos, right, Kayla? Controversial Convos.za, which she will put into the chat. And so I will just pass on to Hanan to conclude for us.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for those insightful answers. I think it's so important for conversations like these to be happening. And I'd also just like to add that while it is very meaningful for us all to be engaged in the struggle during the 16 days of activism, it's important to realize that gender-based violence happens to women and girls every day. So we need to be implementing our activism into our daily lives, even if it's in small ways, like speaking out to raise awareness, or being a Karen, or simply just checking in on your friends and giving them support. But also, as mentioned, don't forget to look after your own mental health. And then I would just like to encourage everyone here also to donate to your local NGOs or to organizations such as Lawyers Against Abuse and the Rape Crisis Center. So like, instead of going out tomorrow night, use the money that you would have spent in a donation so that we can all help make just a small change. So yeah, that's just my little contribution. And thank you once again to everyone and to my co-hosts. It has really been such a wonderful, insightful, informative session. And we, we hope to host this again next year. This is our second year hosting. Thank you to our parents as well for joining. We learned a lot, and the session was recorded, so we will be uploading it. And yeah, we hope to see you next year. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good evening and a wonderful festive season.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you, Prof.
Well done to you guys.
Well done, guys.
You did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you for believing in us
us.
and joining us today. Okay, let me end this meeting.